In 1944, as the tide of war turned against the Third Reich, captured German generals were shipped across the Atlantic expecting punishment and humiliation. Instead, they found spotless barracks, hot showers, and toilets with running water luxuries some hadn't seen even in their own headquarters. In a Texas camp surrounded by barbed wire and magnolia trees, the officers struggled to reconcile what they saw. A nation that treated its enemies with dignity while bombing their homeland into ruin. Their surprise turned into something deeper, a quiet questioning of everything they'd fought for. The morning General Major Erich Reinhardt surrendered. The sky over Normandy hung thick with smoke from burning vehicles. His staff car had taken shrapnel 2 kilometers from the coast, leaving him and 3 junior officers stranded in an apple orchard. The trees, once heavy with fruit, now bore only torn branches and the acrid smell of cordite. When the American infantry unit found them at dawn, Reinhardt expected rough treatment. He'd seen the propaganda films, heard the speeches about American barbarity. Instead, a young lieutenant with a Tennessee drawl approached slowly, rifle lowered, and asked in broken German if anyone needed medical attention. Reinhardt's aide, Hauptmann Wilhelm Fischer, had a shrapnel wound in his shoulder. The American medic, a boy who couldn't have been more than 20, cleaned and dressed it with steady hands, offering Fischer water from his own canteen. Reinhardt watched this exchange in silence, feeling something shift in his understanding of the enemy. This was not the behavior of savages. This was discipline of a different kind. "Sir," the lieutenant said in English, which Reinhardt understood well enough, "you and your men will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You have my word." Word. That concept seemed almost quaint after 5 years of war that had devoured such niceties. Yet the young officer spoke it with conviction, as if words still had weight, as if honor hadn't been ground into the mud of 100 battlefields. By afternoon, they were at a collection point with other prisoners, mostly junior officers and enlisted men from units shattered in the hedgerow fighting. General Lieutenant Otto Kruger arrived an hour later, his uniform torn but his bearing still rigid. He and Reinhardt had served together in the Eastern campaigns, had shared the brutal winters and the long retreats. Now they shared this peculiar captivity. "Better the Americans than the Russians," Kruger muttered, accepting a tin cup of coffee from a guard. The brew was terrible, weak and bitter, but it was hot. And no one had struck them or spat in their faces. "That's a low bar," Reinhardt replied. But privately, he agreed. Stories from the Eastern Front spoke of mass executions, of officers shot in ditches. Here, they sat on wooden benches, drinking coffee, while American soldiers processed paperwork with bureaucratic precision. That night, in a temporary holding pen, Reinhardt lay on a canvas cot and stared at the ceiling of the tent. Rain drummed against the fabric. Around him, captured officers spoke in low voices, speculating about their fate. Some expected labor camps in the frozen north. Others feared trials and executions. No one mentioned hot showers or toilets with running water. Such luxuries belonged to the world before the war, a world that now seemed impossibly distant. What struck Reinhardt most was the absence of hatred in his captors' eyes. They were watchful, yes, and armed, but not cruel. When a young lieutenant vomited from stress and dehydration, an American sergeant brought him water and a blanket. The sergeant said nothing, just set them down and walked away. It was the kind of small decency that wars were supposed to destroy. Reinhardt had spent years learning to see the enemy as abstractions, numbers on maps, targets for artillery. But these Americans were stubbornly, inconveniently human. They chewed gum and told jokes in a language that sounded like gravel in a cement mixer. They wrote letters home and showed each other photographs of sweethearts. They treated prisoners not as vermin to be exterminated, but as defeated soldiers who'd simply been on the wrong side of superior logistics. "You know what I find most unsettling?" Kruger said quietly, lying on the cot beside him. "They don't seem angry. After everything we've done to their boys in France, in Africa, they just seem tired." Reinhardt had no answer. He'd grown accustomed to the rage of war, the hot fury that made men capable of terrible things. This cool efficiency, this bureaucratic compassion, was something new, something that made him profoundly uncomfortable, though he couldn't yet say why. The Liberty ship that carried them westward was called the SS George Washington Carver, a name that meant nothing to Reinhardt until an English-speaking guard explained that Carver had been a scientist, a former slave who revolutionized agriculture. That a nation would name its vessels after such men told him something about American values he hadn't considered. The crossing took 12 days. The prisoners were housed in converted cargo holds, bunks stacked 3 high, but the space was clean and well ventilated. Twice daily, they were allowed on deck for exercise and fresh air. The Atlantic in September was temperamental calm 1 hour, violent the next, but Reinhardt found he didn't mind the motion. It gave him time to think, to watch the endless gray water and consider what lay ahead. Meals arrived with military punctuality. Breakfast at 0700. Lunch at 1200. Dinner at 1800. The food was bland but adequate: powdered eggs, tinned meat, bread that tasted of preservation rather than flour. What surprised the prisoners was the quantity. There was enough. In Germany, even officers had grown accustomed to reduced rations, to meals that left you functional but never full. Here, seconds were available. Men who'd spent months at the front, subsisting on ersatz coffee and stale pumpernickel, approached the serving line with disbelief. "It's propaganda," Kruger insisted, pushing beans around his tray. "They feed us well now, fatten us up for the cameras. Then we'll see the real America." But Reinhardt wasn't sure. The American guards ate the same food from the same kitchen. There was no separate, superior officer's mess. The ship's captain, when he made his rounds, spoke briefly with the senior German officers, inquired about their health, and moved on. There was no gloating, no theatrical displays of triumph. On the 5th day out, a young Oberleutnant named Hartmann fell ill with appendicitis. The ship's doctor, a Captain Davis from Maryland, operated that evening in the medical bay. Reinhardt and Kruger were allowed to observe, standing in a corner while Davis worked with calm competence, assisted by 2 Navy corpsmen. "Hold this light steady," Davis said to one of his assistants, not looking up from the incision. His hands moved with practiced precision, no wasted motion. Reinhardt had seen field surgeons work in worse conditions, amputating limbs in muddy aid stations while shells fell nearby. But there was something different about this: the cleanliness of the instruments, the careful attention to sterile procedure, the way Davis spoke to the unconscious patient as if he could hear. "You'll be fine, Lieutenant," Davis said softly in German, stitching the incision closed. "Rest now." Hartmann survived the surgery and recovered in a clean bed with white sheets. A corpsman checked on him every 4 hours, changing dressings, administering medications. When Reinhardt visited the next day, Hartmann was pale but alert. "Sir," he said, struggling to sit up, "they gave me morphine for the pain. Real morphine, not the synthetic substitute. And the doctor, he called me Lieutenant. Not prisoner, not enemy, just Lieutenant." Reinhardt had no response that wouldn't sound like he was defending the indefensible. He simply nodded and told Hartmann to rest. That evening, on deck, he stood with Kruger watching the sun sink into the western horizon. The sky blazed orange and gold, indifferent to the affairs of men. "Otto," Reinhardt said quietly, "what are we going to tell them when we get home?" "About all this?" Kruger was silent for a long moment. "The truth, I suppose. That we were treated correctly, according to international law. That the Americans honored the conventions. And will anyone believe us?" Another silence, longer this time. Then Kruger said, "Does it matter? The war is lost, Erich. Everyone knows it, even if no one says it aloud. We're just waiting for the formalities now." Reinhardt wanted to argue, to defend the Reich, but the words stuck in his throat. Looking out at the darkening ocean, he felt the weight of all his certainties beginning to shift, like cargo breaking loose in a storm. They docked in Norfolk, Virginia, on a morning bright with autumn Sunday. The harbor bustled with activity freighters unloading supplies, destroyers putting out to sea, dockhands shouting, instructions in accents that ranged from Boston Irish to Louisiana Creole. America was vast and loud and bewilderingly diverse. The prisoners were transferred to trains for the journey south. Reinhardt watched the countryside roll past the windows, small towns with white churches, farms with neat fences, billboards advertising Coca-Cola and Lucky Strike cigarettes. Even in wartime, even with rationing, there was an abundance here that Europe had forgotten. Cars on the roads, lights in windows, children playing in yards. The war seemed distant, abstract, something happening to other people in other places. "Look at this," Kruger said, gesturing at the landscape. Untouched, no bomb craters, no rubble, no refugees. They have no idea what war really means. But Reinhardt wasn't sure that was true. They passed through a town where a banner hung across the main street. "Welcome home. Heroes." Below it, a smaller sign listed names, sons of the town who wouldn't be coming home. The war had touched even this quiet place, had reached across an ocean to take its toll. Camp Hearn in Texas announced itself, with guard towers and chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. The landscape was flat, punctuated by scrub, oak, and mesquite. Heat shimmered off the ground despite the approaching winter. It looked, Reinhardt thought, like no place he'd ever been. The camp commandant, Colonel James Wilcox, met them at the gate. He was tall and spare, with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of a man who'd spent his career outdoors. He addressed the arriving prisoners in clear, if accented, German. "Gentlemen," he said, "you are now prisoners of war under the custody of the United States Army. You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will be housed, fed, and cared for as soldiers, not as criminals. We expect discipline and respect. In return, you have my word that no one here will abuse or humiliate you. You are soldiers, not animals." That phrase, "not animals," would echo through Reinhardt's thoughts for months to come. It was such a simple statement, almost banal. Yet it carried implications that made him profoundly uncomfortable. If they weren't animals, if they retained their dignity as soldiers, then what did that say about the camps they'd built? About the orders they'd followed? About the machinery of dehumanization they'd been part of? The barracks were simple wooden structures, raised on piers to allow air circulation underneath. Inside, they found bunks with mattresses, thin but clean footlockers for personal items, and windows that opened to catch the breeze. At the end of each building stood the latrines. Reinhardt walked in and stopped. The room was tiled, floors and walls, in white ceramic. 6 toilets sat in individual stalls, each with a real porcelain bowl and a tank mounted above. 6 sinks with running water. 2 shower stalls with adjustable heads and knobs for hot and cold. Behind him, Kruger let out a sound that might have been laughter or despair. "My God," he said. "Erich. My God." Other officers crowded in, staring at the fixtures with expressions ranging from disbelief to something approaching grief. Oberst Heinrich Brandt, who'd commanded a panzer division in North Africa, turned on a tap and watched water pour out, clear and clean. He let it run over his hands, then cupped them and drank. "It's not even rationed," he said, voice hollow. "They have so much water they use it to flush away waste." That night, lying on his bunk in the darkness, Reinhardt thought about the latrines. In the field, they'd used trenches and buckets. In permanent positions, crude wooden structures over pits. Even at headquarters, facilities had been basic at best. And yet here, in a prison camp thousands of kilometers from home, in the middle of the Texas plains, their enemies had built them bathrooms that would have been luxurious in a Berlin hotel. The first shower Reinhardt took lasted 20 minutes. Hot water, real hot water from pipes, not heated in kettles over a fire. He stood under the stream and let it wash away months of grime, of dust from French roads and salt from the Atlantic crossing. The soap was American ivory, it said on the wrapper, and it lathered, rich and clean. There were razors in a dispenser by the sinks, clean blades in paper packets, and shaving cream in aerosol cans that seemed miraculous in their convenience. "This is obscene," Kruger said, toweling off. But he didn't sound angry. He sounded lost. "We're prisoners. We killed their men. And they give us this. The camp had rules about cleanliness that were strictly enforced. Barracks were inspected weekly. Beds had to be made to military standards. Floors swept daily. Latrines cleaned twice a day by rotating work details. But what struck Reinhardt was that the American guards did the same work. He saw them mopping floors, emptying trash bins, maintaining equipment. There was no caste system here. No division between those who worked and those who commanded. Even Colonel Wilcox, inspecting the facilities, ran a white-gloved finger along a windowsill and nodded when it came away clean. The camp employed a sanitation officer, a Captain Rodriguez who'd been a public health inspector in Los Angeles before the war. He gave lectures voluntary but well-attended on hygiene, disease prevention, and nutrition. He explained how clean water and proper sewage disposal had reduced mortality rates in American cities, how something as simple as washing hands could prevent epidemics. "My grandfather died in a cholera outbreak," Rodriguez said during one lecture. His Spanish-accented English, translated by a bilingual prisoner. He lived in a city with no proper sanitation, waste in the streets, wells contaminated. We've learned that civilization isn't just about art and philosophy. It's about keeping people healthy. It's about respecting life enough to prevent unnecessary death. Reinhardt sat in the back of the room listening. He thought about the camps he'd authorized supplies for, the reports he'd signed without reading too carefully. Typhus, dysentery, malnutrition numbers on paper, problems for someone else to solve. He'd told himself it was war, that resources were scarce, that hard choices had to be made. But here was proof that it didn't have to be that way. Even prisoners, even enemies, could be kept clean and healthy if you decided that was important. One morning, watching a work crew replace a broken faucet in the latrine, he realized something. The Americans didn't see this as charity or propaganda. They saw it as basic competence, as the minimum standard for running any facility that housed human beings. The efficiency wasn't cruelty. It was care systematized. "They're soft," Kruger insisted when Reinhardt shared this observation. All this concern for comfort and cleanliness, it's weakness. A strong nation doesn't coddle its enemies, but Reinhardt wasn't sure. A strong nation, truly strong, might be one that could afford generosity. That didn't need cruelty to assert its power. That understood hygiene and dignity weren't luxuries but foundations of civilization itself. Camp Hearn settled into routines. Reveille at 0600, breakfast at 0700, work details at 0800. Officers weren't required to work another Geneva Convention provision, but many volunteered. There were jobs in the camp gardens, in the library, teaching English classes to enlisted prisoners in adjacent compounds. Reinhardt chose the library. It was a small building near the camp's center, stocked with books donated by churches and civic organizations across Texas. He'd always been a reader, had studied philosophy and history before the war pulled him into a career he'd never planned. Now he found himself cataloging volumes, learning the Dewey Decimal System, helping younger prisoners find books in a language most of them barely understood. The camp showed films twice a week in the recreation hall. American movies, mostly westerns with John Wayne, comedies with Charlie Chaplin. The humor was often too fast, too culturally specific, but the images spoke clearly enough. Wide open spaces, small towns, individuals standing up to corruption and tyranny. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Propaganda, Kruger said after a showing of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. They want us to believe in their democratic fantasy. But others saw it differently. Major Felix Brenner, who'd taught literature before the war, pointed out the film's critique of political corruption. Its suggestion that American democracy was imperfect and required constant vigilance. "They show us their weaknesses," Brenner said. "They admit their system has flaws. When did we ever do that? When did we ever make films questioning our own leaders?" The camp had a chapel, non-denominational, where Protestant and Catholic services were held on Sundays. Reinhardt hadn't been religious since boyhood, but he found himself attending. There was something comforting about the rituals, the familiar prayers in German, the temporary escape from the moral confusion that plagued his waking hours. Father Dietrich, a captured chaplain from the Afrika Korps, led the Catholic services. He was a small man with gentle eyes and hands that trembled slightly, a tremor he'd developed after 2 years at the front. In his homilies, he never mentioned politics or war. He spoke instead about mercy, forgiveness, the difficulty of maintaining faith when the world seemed determined to destroy it. "We are far from home," he said one Sunday. "Many of us will not see our families for years, perhaps never. But God is not confined by borders or barbed wire. Wherever we are, whatever we've done, redemption remains possible if we're willing to acknowledge our failings and seek to do better." Reinhardt wasn't sure he believed in God anymore, but he believed in the possibility of being better. The camp, with its strange combination of imprisonment and dignity, seemed designed to encourage that belief. The Americans didn't lecture them about democracy or try to convert them to capitalism. They simply demonstrated an alternative, a system where even the defeated were treated as human beings worthy of basic respect. The Texas heat gradually gave way to something that passed for winter in this part of the world. Cool mornings, mild afternoons, evening temperatures that dropped just enough to require a jacket. The magnolia trees near the commandant's office lost their leaves. The work details switched from harvesting to maintenance, preparing the camp for spring planting. Reinhardt learned the rhythms of this new life, the sound of the flagpole rope clanging against the metal pole in the wind, the smell of coffee brewing in the mess hall at dawn, the sight of guards changing shifts, tired men going off duty while fresh ones took their posts. It was all so ordinary, so bureaucratically mundane, that sometimes he forgot he was a prisoner. Then he'd see the wire, the towers, and remember, the camp's mail system operated with surprising efficiency. Letters could be sent home, subject to censorship, twice a month. Incoming mail was less reliable. The German postal system had essentially collapsed, and many prisoners received nothing for months. But the opportunity to write, to maintain some connection with the world beyond the wire, was offered freely. Reinhardt wrote to his wife, Anna, carefully composing each letter to pass the censor's review. He couldn't mention military matters or politics, couldn't say anything that might be considered intelligence. So he wrote about small things, the weather, the books he was reading, the routines of camp life. In his 4th letter, written in November, he attempted something more difficult. "Dearest Anna, I hope this letter finds you and the children safe. I think of you constantly. Wonder about your days. Pray for your health. Life here continues in ways I would not have imagined before my capture. We are treated, I must tell you, with a correctness that surprises me. Not kindness, exactly, but a firm adherence to rules that protect us from abuse or degradation. The Americans are pragmatic people. They have built facilities here that function with impressive efficiency. We have running water, proper sanitation, medical care. The food is adequate, if uninspired. We are housed in barracks that, while simple, are maintained to high standards of cleanliness. I realize how strange this must sound. We are prisoners, defeated enemies, and yet we are not treated as such. Rather, we are processed, managed, cared for as a logistical challenge to be solved. They have defeated us, Anna, not only with weapons but with systems, with plumbing and medicine and bureaucratic thoroughness. There is a lesson in this that I am only beginning to understand. I cannot write much more, as letters are limited in length. Know that I am well, that I think of you always, that I hope for reunion even as I struggle to imagine what that reunion will look like after all that has happened. With all my love, Erich. The letter was returned to him 3 days later with certain passages highlighted by the censor. The comment about being defeated by systems had been flagged, but ultimately approved. A note in the margin, in English, read, "Thoughtful. No security concerns. Approved for transmission." That a censor would engage intellectually with a prisoner's private correspondence, would acknowledge the thought behind the words, struck Reinhardt as fundamentally American. They couldn't help themselves even in enforcing restrictions. They had to be fair-minded about it. He began keeping a journal, writing in pencil in a notebook provided by the camp store. It wasn't forbidden. Nothing explicitly subversive was, and it gave him an outlet for thoughts he couldn't express in censored letters. The 3rd of December, 1944. Today we learned that the offensive in the Ardennes has stalled. The Americans speak of it as the Battle of the Bulge, a curiously mundane name for what may be our last major effort. I feel no pride in hearing of it. Only a weary sadness. How many more will die before we accept what everyone here already knows? Captain Rodriguez gave another lecture today, this one on water treatment. He explained how they filter and chlorinate the water supply, testing it daily for contaminants. Such attention to detail for prisoners. Meanwhile, I remember reports from the camps: never enough clean water, disease spreading, bodies stacked. We claimed scarcity, blamed the Allied bombing. But here is proof that even in war, even with limited resources, it is possible to maintain standards if you consider it important. What have we become? What did I become? Signing requisition forms and troop movements, never asking what happened at the end of those paper trails. The question haunted him through the winter months. Other prisoners were asking similar questions, gathering in small groups after dinner to debate philosophy and politics in low voices. Not everyone was ready to question, to doubt. Kruger remained stubbornly loyal, insisted this was all temporary, that Germany would rally, that secret weapons would turn the tide. But others, Brenner, Brandt, Father Dietrich, engaged in careful, painful re-examination of beliefs they'd held since youth. Lieutenant Samuel Porter had not expected to like his job as a guard at Camp Hearn, but he'd discovered a grudging respect for the men behind the wire. They were professional soldiers, most of them, and they maintained discipline even in defeat. Every morning, they formed ranks for count, stood at attention, saluted their own officers. The precision of it, the refusal to become slovenly or demoralized, impressed him. Porter was from Georgia, had worked construction before the war. He'd joined up after Pearl Harbor, expecting to fight in Europe or the Pacific. Instead, he'd been assigned to POW camp duty, which felt like missing the real war. But Colonel Wilcox had set him straight during orientation. The way we treat prisoners is just as important as what happens on the battlefield, Wilcox had said. Maybe more important. We're demonstrating that our values survive contact with our enemies, that we don't abandon our principles when it becomes inconvenient. That's what separates us from the regimes we're fighting. So Porter did his job conscientiously. He learned enough German to communicate basic instructions. He enforced rules fairly, wrote up guards who were abusive or lazy. He watched the prisoners, tried to understand them as individuals rather than as abstractions. General Reinhardt intrigued him. The man was clearly educated, spoke excellent English, carried himself with quiet dignity. He didn't swagger or bluster like some of the other senior officers. He seemed genuinely interested in understanding America, asked questions about history and government during the English classes he attended. One afternoon in January, Porter was supervising a work detail, repairing fencing, when Reinhardt approached. "Lieutenant," Reinhardt said, "may I ask you something?" Porter nodded, wary but curious. "Why do you do this work yourself?" Reinhardt gestured at the fence post Porter had been setting. "You are an officer. You could simply give orders." Porter considered the question. "Sir, where I come from, a man who can't do the work himself has no business telling others how to do it. Doesn't matter what your rank is. If the fence needs fixing, you fix it." Reinhardt nodded slowly. "Respect through competence, not through authority." Something like that. They worked in silence for a while. Porter teaching Reinhardt how to properly tamp earth around a post. It was absurd. He reflected a German general taking instruction from a Georgia carpenter's son on fence repair. But Reinhardt didn't seem to mind. He worked carefully, asked questions, learned. Later, Porter wrote in his own journal a habit he'd picked up from a college English class years ago. "The generals salute better than we do. Their formations are sharper, their discipline tighter. If we'd fought them on drill parade grounds instead of battlefields, they'd have won, handily." But war isn't about looking good in formation. It's about logistics, production, getting supplies where they're needed, when they're needed. It's about treating your soldiers well so they stay healthy and motivated. The Germans learned tactics from Clausewitz, but we learned systems from Ford. Mass production, standardization, efficiency. Even in something as simple as a prison camp latrine, you can see the difference in philosophy. General Reinhardt is starting to understand that, I think. He watches everything, takes it all in. The other day I saw him at the water fountain, just staring at it while the water ran, like he was trying to memorize it or puzzle out what it meant. I wonder what he'll tell his people when he goes home. I wonder if they'll believe him. Spring came to Texas in an explosion of wildflowers. Bluebonnets covered the fields beyond the wire, stretching to the horizon in waves of color. The prisoners, many of whom had spent years in the gray devastation of bombed cities and battlefields, stood at the fence and stared. Some wept. Beauty, Reinhardt reflected, could be as devastating as horror in its ability to strip away defenses. He'd been assigned as an English tutor for newly arrived prisoners, men captured in the final collapse of German forces in the West. They arrived angry, defiant, still full of propaganda and false hope. It was Reinhardt's job to help them adjust, to teach them enough English to follow camp regulations. But language lessons inevitably became something more. The new prisoners asked questions. Is it true about the showers? Do they really feed us regularly? Why haven't they beaten us? And Reinhardt had to answer. Had to explain that, yes, it was all true. That the stories they'd been told about American savagery were lies. This is trick, insisted Unteroffizier Klaus Lehmann, a 20-year-old from Munich who'd been captured near Cologne. They soften us up, then comes punishment. There is no punishment, Reinhardt said quietly. This is simply how they operate. They have systems, rules, and they follow them. Even for us, then they are fools. Reinhardt didn't argue. He simply pointed at the recreation hall, the library, the medical clinic. If they are fools, they are very consistent fools. One night in April, an incident occurred that crystallized something for Reinhardt. One of the prisoners, a young lieutenant named Georg Pohl, collapsed during evening formation. Heat stroke. The camp doctor determined Pohl had been working outside all day without adequate water, trying to prove his toughness to the other men. Reinhardt was in the barracks when he heard the commotion. By the time he reached the formation area, 2 American medics were already there, loading Pohl onto a stretcher. Lieutenant Porter was standing nearby, looking concerned. He'll be fine, Porter said, noticing Reinhardt. We're taking him to the clinic for observation and fluids. Thank you, Reinhardt said automatically. What struck him, what he couldn't stop thinking about later, was that no one had ordered the medics to help. There'd been no debate about whether Pohl deserved care, no calculation of cost versus benefit. The man had collapsed, and immediately the system had activated to help him. It was automatic, reflexive, built into the structure of how things worked. Reinhardt thought about the times he'd seen similar situations handled differently. The soldier with frostbite in Russia, left behind because the retreat couldn't be slowed. The prisoner who'd asked for water and been struck instead. The casual cruelties that had seemed normal, necessary, justified by circumstances. He walked to the chapel that evening, found Father Dietrich preparing for the next day's service. Father, Reinhardt said, I need to confess something. Dietrich looked up from his Bible. I'm not hearing formal confessions, Erich. I don't have the authority here. This isn't about authority. It's about acknowledging what I've done. They sat together in the quiet chapel. Outside, the Texas night was full of insect songs. Reinhardt spoke slowly, carefully, about the orders he'd signed, the reports he'd filed, the things he'd known but not acted on. He didn't excuse himself or minimize his role. He simply laid it out, all of it, letting the weight of his complicity settle between them. I told myself it was war, he finished, that these were necessary compromises. But I see now that it wasn't necessity. It was choice. We chose to build systems of dehumanization. The Americans have chosen differently. They've built systems that preserve dignity even for their enemies. Both are choices. Both are possible. Father Dietrich was silent for a long moment. Then he said, Understanding. That is the first step, Erich. But understanding alone doesn't absolve. You'll carry this knowledge for the rest of your life. The question is what you do with it. What can I do? The war is over, or nearly so. Germany will be occupied, probably divided. I'm just one man who helped build something terrible, perhaps one man who can help build something better. If you get the chance, Reinhardt sat in the chapel after Dietrich left, thinking about that possibility. Building something better. It seemed impossible, absurdly optimistic. But then, 6 months ago, he would have said it was impossible that he'd be sitting in a Texas prison camp, having his moral certainties dismantled by clean toilets and Geneva Convention, compliant treatment. The news of Germany's surrender reached Camp Herne on the 8th of May, 1945. Colonel Wilcox called an assembly, addressed the prisoners in careful German. "The war in Europe is over," he said. "Your nation has surrendered unconditionally. You will remain here until arrangements can be made for repatriation. I know this is difficult news. You have my sympathy, but you also have my continued assurance that you will be treated with dignity during your remaining time in American custody." The prisoners received the announcement in silence. Some stood rigid, faces blank. Others slumped, the final hope draining away. A few wept. Reinhardt felt only a strange emptiness, as if something vital had been hollowed out of him. The war he'd fought, the cause he'd served, was finished. He was 43 years old, and his entire adult life had been defined by a project that had ended in complete catastrophe. That evening, he and Kruger sat outside their barracks, watching the sun set over the Texas plains. They didn't speak for a long time. There was nothing much to say. The future was an undiscovered country, and they were both too exhausted to speculate about it. "What will you do?" Kruger finally asked. "When we go home?" "If there's a home to go back to," Reinhardt said. "The reports say Berlin is rubble. Everything is rubble. Then we rebuild. What else is there?" Reinhardt thought about the camp, about systems and choices, about the difference between organization that served cruelty and organization that served dignity. "We rebuild differently," he said. "We rebuild without the lies, without the myths about superiority and destiny. We rebuild on truth." Kruger made a sound that might have been laughter or disgust. "Truth. What is truth, Erich? We lost. The victors will write their truth, and we'll be the villains of the story. Perhaps we should be," Reinhardt said quietly. "Perhaps that's the truth we need to start with." Repatriation began in late 1945, but senior officers were held longer for debriefing and documentation. Reinhardt didn't mind. He had no eagerness to return to a devastated homeland, to face the judgment of people who'd suffered while he sat in relative comfort behind barbed wire in Texas. He used the time to read, to think, to prepare himself for whatever came next. In March 1946, he and Kruger were finally informed they'd be leaving. The night before departure, Lieutenant Porter came to say goodbye. "General," Porter said, extending his hand, "I hope you find peace at home. I hope there's something left to rebuild." Reinhardt shook his hand, felt the calluses that came from honest work. "Lieutenant, I want to thank you, not just for the treatment here, but for the lesson. You showed me that strength doesn't require cruelty, that discipline can coexist with mercy. I hope I can carry that forward." Porter looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Just did my job, sir. That's precisely the point. Your job was to maintain human dignity. Ours was to destroy it. The difference matters." The journey home was by ship again, but this time to a different Germany. The land they returned to was divided, occupied, devastated beyond anything Reinhardt had imagined. Berlin was a moonscape of rubble. Entire cities had been erased. The people were hollow-eyed, desperate, scavenging survival from the ruins. Kruger disappeared into the chaos, went searching for family Reinhardt hoped he'd find. They never saw each other again. Reinhardt found Anna and the children in a displaced persons camp near Frankfurt. She'd survived the bombings, kept the children alive through the final terrible months. They barely recognized each other. She was gaunt, aged beyond her years. and he was a stranger returning from a war that had changed him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. They didn't speak much about the lost years. There were too many ghosts between them. But slowly, in the ruins of the old Germany, they built a modest life. Reinhardt found work with the American occupation authorities, translating documents, helping to organize relief efforts. The work was humble, bureaucratic, but he approached it with a seriousness that impressed his supervisors. By 1950, with the Cold War reshaping Europe's landscape, there was discussion of rebuilding German military forces. Reinhardt was approached about helping to establish a new military academy, one that would train officers for what would become the Bundeswehr, a force bound by democratic values and international law. He accepted, but with conditions. The academy would emphasize not just tactics and strategy, but ethics and international humanitarian law. Officers would study the failures of the past, would be taught that following orders was not an excuse for participating in atrocities. And the facilities would be clean, modern, dignified, not as a luxury, but as a reminder that how you treat people, even in contexts of authority and hierarchy, reveals your true values. The academy opened in 1954. Reinhardt served as an instructor in military ethics until his retirement in 1968. He published one book in that time, a memoir titled Clean Hands: Lessons from Captivity. It was not widely read. Germans were not eager to hear about the comfort of American prison camps when so many had suffered so much. But it found an audience among military educators, among people trying to understand how nations rebuild moral frameworks after catastrophic failure. On the 10th anniversary of the Academy's opening, Reinhardt attended a ceremony dedicating the new dormitory facilities. The buildings were modern, equipped with the latest amenities. During the tour, he stepped into a bathroom tiled in white, with proper showers and toilets, everything clean and functional. He stood there for a long moment, hand on the sink, water running over his fingers. A young cadet, passing by, looked at him curiously. "Sir, are you all right?" Reinhardt smiled, turned off the tap. "Yes, thank you. I'm fine. I was just remembering something." That evening, back in his modest apartment, he wrote in the journal he still kept. "They teach us in war to dehumanize the enemy, to make them abstractions so we can do what needs to be done. But the Americans taught me something different, that you reveal your true character not in how you treat your friends, but in how you treat those who are in your power." We built camps where people died of disease and despair, and we called it necessity. They built camps where even enemies were kept clean and fed, and they called it civilized behavior. The war taught me that true power is not in the ability to destroy, nor in the willingness to show cruelty. True power lies in restraint, in the conscious choice to maintain one's humanity even when you could choose otherwise. It lies in building systems that preserve dignity, rather than systems that destroy it. I cannot undo what was done. I cannot bring back the dead or repair the shattered. But I can teach the next generation to ask different questions, to make different choices. I can help build a military that understands service means something other than blind obedience to authority. In Texas, in a camp surrounded by barbed wire and magnolia trees, I learned what I should have known all along, that civilization is measured not by monuments or victories, but by the care we take with those who have no power to resist us. The water running through those pipes, the soap in those showers, the toilets that flushed these, were not mere conveniences. They were statements of principle, declarations that every human being deserves basic dignity. We lost the war. But in losing, some of us learned what we should have known before it started. For that lesson, paid for in blood and ruin, I am grateful. Reinhardt closed the journal and sat in silence, listening to the sounds of a rebuilt Germany cars passing on the street, music from a neighbor's radio, children playing in the courtyard below. The past could not be changed, but the future remained uncertain, full of possibility for those willing to learn from catastrophe. He thought of Lieutenant Porter, wondered what had become of him. He thought of Colonel Wilcox and Captain Rodriguez, of Father Dietrich and Otto Kruger, and all the others whose paths had crossed his in that strange interlude between war and peace. He thought of the young soldiers he now taught, trying to give them the tools to be better than their predecessors had been. Outside, night fell over the academy. In the dormitory bathrooms, water ran clean through modern pipes. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary miracle. But Reinhardt knew now that civilization was built from small things, from ordinary miracles multiplied across systems and sustained by choice. He turned off the light and went to bed, carrying his memories and his lessons forward into whatever time remained.